Hello everyone, today as our customary habit on Schwerpunkt, we talk about Operation Overlord on the anniversary of its launch. These videos have increased over time. I should create a playlist. It's mostly from last year that we began to discuss World War II also in some greater depth. So I thought today to dedicate this video to a really classic in say the history of World War II, of the campaign of Normandy, and properly involving the D-Day +1 as well, and more actually, because the thing would extend further, as we explained in the video about properly the initial phases of the landings, etc. But things were extremely delicate in terms of odds of balance. It's not before days of relentless fighting that the Allies secured their beachhead that was really threatened at different times by German counterattacks, and also the general unpredictability of the pretty chaotic situation that had, of course, unfolded on both sides for different reasons, right? There were also some unwanted, actually some specific Allied mistake that ended up actually compromising the German positions more than anything. So providing with all the useful consequences of the case. Today we talk about the assault on the Pointe du Hoc that I had the pleasure, by the way, of visiting in 2014. So during the 70th anniversary was on the same days. Actually a bit later, in the end of June, the beginning of July. Beautiful places. I had the chance of visiting different locations. At some point I may show you the photos, but this is not much the point. I visited probably the Pointe du Hoc, and say the emotions. I will not describe this because it's really strange to get there. Telling the truth, like from at least the perspective of somebody who has been interested in the Rangers assault since he was little and watched especially many movies about that, played video games about that. It really, the effect is really incredible, especially when coupled with all the different elements of the Norman landscape. Just as a medieval history-based channel, Bayeux is not very far away. So visiting, for example, the tapestry, the tapisserie is also another incredible experience that gives you sort of the depth of history, also beyond Normandy itself. There is this atmosphere you can perceive very well. When I arrived in Rouen, for example, there is this almost foggy weather, almost reminiscent of England when I visited there as well. That gave you that also very strong sense of Viking, sort of properly Northern European opening to that broader coldness of the other side. The reason for which I would actually like to discuss the assault on Pointe du Hoc from mostly like something we do on Schwerpunkt, because we definitely dedicated many videos to probably the moral forces, which is not strictly speaking the personal, individual, subjective experience of the fighter in combat during these actions, but something similar to that. At least we can observe how the military dimension, the theoretical at least pattern that we use to describe what eventually occurs, that indeed aligns to that, but that eventually intertwines with humanity at a level that is difficult to describe given the intensity of the same. There are surely many videos that we could make about the Rangers' assault and the siege, let's say, of the German position. However, this is a key to interpret that, to illustrate it, to narrate it, right? Of course, there are lots of videos about the assault on the Pointe du Hoc that is, again, very epic, very iconic. So, especially on YouTube, I don't pretend to provide with something dramatically, not necessarily innovative, but something surprising or something that nobody has ever heard, especially in the U.S. You can imagine, mostly among all the Allies nations. But that at least is branded by Schwerpunkt, and that, if anything, adds to the content we're gradually accumulating, in fact, about World War II, and in this case, the Battle of Normandy. So, on June the 6th, 1944, Colonel James E. Ruther, a 30-year-old Texan commanding the 2nd Ranger Battalion, led D, E, and F companies. We're talking approximately 225 elite infantrymen rigorously trained in cliff scaling, hand-to-hand combat, and small unit tactics in this incredibly high-stakes mission to neutralize 6 155mm Grand Puissant Filou howitzers of the German 352nd Artillery Regiment at Pointe du Hoc. This position held a great strategic relevance, in fact perched atop about 30 meters cliffs overlooking the Normandy coast. This 12 hectares battery was a cornerstone of Hitler's Atlantic Wall, designed to dominate the approaches to Omaha and Utah beaches with 5.5 kilometers salvos capable of sinking landing craft and disrupting Allied beach heads. We have seen in the video about the landings how difficult Omaha in particular really was. A failure, even one of the handful of Allied sectors along the coastline would have resulted in the collapse of the entire beachhead and basically the failure of Operation Overlord. This could have happened just had the tide been a few centimeters higher or lower. So we're talking about, of course, one of the greatest masterpiece, at least in 20th century warfare, one that definitely deserves Eisenhower with the title of the greatest commander of the century. And definitely laid out in this picture very well as an incredible risk that could, of course, make the entire course of the war go brutally different direction, for the entire globe to suffer of the consequences, in part unpredictable, but surely not better than the ones we have witnessed. And generally speaking, tied, in fact, to this very single aspect. We talked often, even just from a theoretical point of view, what it means, what the term decisive means, right? Or what the verb to determine means. Von Clausewitz tells, ironically but correctly, that the only decisive battle is the last, meaning that there isn't such a thing like in war, like a single factor making the 50% plus one. When you look at Stalingrad, Midway, El Alamein, people talk about the turning point, and there is, of course, like a broader set of a broader flow that unfolds, surely passing through this, but it's a deep mistake to presume that war is simply something that goes on per se, that has a specific cycle that must be fulfilled. It's just a political instrument, and it responds to that specific purpose. In this sense, war is a lot of, it shows us should be seen as a 50% plus one when we talk about what actually decides, who actually wins, by understanding that, of course, that 50 plus 1 is literally 50 times 1 plus 1. And so that this apparently little, but as you understand also from these smaller actions, like incredible feats at point, factors, elements, all have a crucial role, because if everything is truly decided by plus 1, all those 50 are interchangeable with that one that we want to, for some reason, isolate and make all the whole thing revolving around. People have really serious problems to understand what that means. To determine stands for exactly meaning that was the 50% plus 1. That's not exactly correct, unless you specify that, of course, this factor determined others, right, or was one among the others, and it's not merely the size of one. This is the tip of the iceberg, right? Had this failed, likely the whole thing would have crumbled. And it's not a matter of luck; it's also a matter of luck. It's not only, but this is war, so you have guys from the other side that also are battling such odds. They have their own 50%, and mostly in this, the greater the fight, tendentially, the more balanced the odds, right? So from the German side, you could see also very interesting things, and we talked about this in the videos about the Normandy landing. Is also the course of the Battle of Normandy, because we dealt with everything, also following in the ensuing weeks. In any case, when we look at the Pointe du Hoc, and you can obviously understand this when you are there. By the way, it's beautiful because seeing the pictures, etc. But when you are there, you get a physical, very concrete, graphic idea of how the sheer power of the Allied naval artillery. These craters are enormous. They're still there. Grass has grown over them, but it gives you an idea of how hard the German positions were pounded by the naval guns. So the Pointe du Hoc, we all know also that artillery alone does not solve problems. You can blow the heck out of so many fortifications, their garrisons, etc. But in order to seize them, you must send someone literally do that, right? And there is always going to be someone still defending. You can't just do that with heavy bombing. And I would say Overlord shows that pretty well, because the Allied bombing was really very, very intense, right? Both from the air, from the sea especially. In any case, this is the point. The Pointe du Hoc was a fortress encircled by double-layered barbed wire entanglements, Teller and Shoe anti-personnel mines, in a network of reinforced concrete casemates, observation posts, and interlocking trenches that naturally were all designed to withstand naval attacks and the landings, and against probably also armored forces and beyond. MG-42 machine gun nests firing 1,200 rounds per minute and 20 millimeters flak 38 anti-aircraft guns provided overlapping fields of fire, while a heavily fortified observation bunker at the cliff's edge offered panoramic views of the coastline that, if you've been there, you know are utterly breathtaking, from Grandcamp-Maisy to the Cotentin Peninsula, where also, by the way, the Allies would have turned from this section, in fact, of the beachheads, once having overrun, in fact, the local resistance. Now, this defensive array, manned by approximately 200 Germans from the 726th Infantry Regiment's 9th Company and 352nd Artillery Regiment, made Pointe du Hoc, as Admiral Hall's intelligence officer warned, quote, a grim target where, quote, 3 old women with brooms could keep the Rangers from climbing that cliff. Consider that not only that, but that, as we've seen, the Germans could pour fire on the beaches from there. There was all a system, we've seen it especially for Omaha, of enfilade fire. It was really by far the worst terrain, or at least it's also the one that turned out to be, because the Allies expected, of course, resistance to be dire there, but also much heavier in other places where things went relatively smoothly. In any case, this elevated position in the hands of the Germans risked to compromise basically the entire landings, especially in Omaha. And the psychological strain, of course, of anyone who has to get on top of that hill from the sea, being bombarded, was palpable. I would like, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, to stress this human dimension, right? From a strictly psychophysical point of view, Rangers faced the cliffs with pounding hearts. You can imagine something like 100, 120 beats per minute. Fortunately, this was, healthy young man. They could withstand that pressure. But imagine your body being flooded with adrenaline. Your muscles are tense, and your mind, especially, that's the real problem, as always, especially in war, was racing with the fear of an enemy entrenched in a near impregnable position. Right? You wouldn't know. Today, we know what happened. All right, so we celebrate it. We say, okay, well, look at how they made it. But in the moment, this is the most important aspect of war. It's unpredictability. You wouldn't really know how the whole thing would go down. It's not even just you had any security. By the way, as any of these rangers to grasp their perspective, that any other thing all around would go well. Maybe they could even succeed, but the entire system could fail anyways. There was a crushing weight that we tried to describe a little bit in the video about Overlord, and Battle of Normandy in general. That is something that it's probably the single most important aspect to focus on, as war is truly a struggle between moral forces that, by the way, reciprocally influence each other. In fact, if you look at the Germans, these were themselves conditioned by the circumstances, but also, in fact, at the same time, years of defensive drills. They exuded confidence in their fortified stronghold. They knew the position very well. All right, having familiarity with the ground you're fighting on it, and especially from this defensive position, regardless of the devastating bombardments that would shock them, was still a major advantage. The looming threat of Allied bombardment, of course, seeded doubt among the Germans, but mostly among the younger conscripts, their pulses as well quickening as they scanned the horizon to find out essentially the magnificent deployment of the Allied fleet. The original plan assigned Radar's executive officer to lead, but when this, incapacitated by drunkenness aboard a transport ship in Weymouth Harbor just the day before, was hospitalized. So we're talking, again, you have to rely on this guy for the operation, and he basically can't hold anxiety, stress just the day before. You imagine the day before. The day before is something that, as a medievalist, we have seen also in some videos. The day before. This is when the epos tells you, right, about who was a coward, who was not, right? The feeling the day before. Today I'm alive, tomorrow I may be dead. Thinking about home, thinking about at night, maybe your last night. And what about the world? What will happen? Many would not know that because literally died on the following day. So this is the difference between literally what makes a decision such, right? And with an unfolding action and responsibility and real life-changing. So at that point, Rader seized command himself. General Clarence Hübner, all these, by the way, German names, of course, among the American, German Americans in great numbers since the 19th century, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, the famous 1st under 5th Corps, protested that Rader was too valuable to risk, quote, getting knocked out in the very first round, right? So Rader was going anyway. He was resolute. Also in his reply, that was, quote, I'm sorry, sir, I'm going to have to disobey you. If I don't take it, it may not go. Right? This naturally underscores his commitment to lead his men personally, a decision later validated by the mission's success against overwhelming odds. Rader's defiance steadied his men, because these are the actions really are able to lift the collective spirits, because this is really about how some supernatural bond is formed, countering their dread, in fact, with a shared resolve, though many later recalled clammy palms and shallow breaths as they boarded their craft. So not even when, of course, they began to hear the bombardment, but when, simply that they were sensing the imminent clash. And so they felt immediately a sense of hiding. Okay, we are on board. There is no coming back here. All right. Radar's force embarked from Weymouth aboard HMS Amsterdam, Ben Mike Cree, and USS LCT-46, the latter carrying 4 DUKW amphibious vehicles fitted with 90-foot, that is essentially almost 30 meters, Merryweather fire ladders for cliff assault. Of course, Rangers had this very specific task, and they were, as we will see now, equipped for the occasion. Guided by Royal Navy Fairmile motor launch ML-304 and 2 landing craft support vessels LCS-91 and LCS-102, the flotilla navigated almost 20 kilometers approach through force 5 winds and waves of almost 2 meters, with vessels shipping water so heavily that the Rangers bailed with their helmets to stay afloat. The Rangers, organized into 3 75-man companies, carried almost 30 kilos packs with M1 Garands, Browning automatic rifles, the famous bars, Thompson submachine guns, the 45-inch pistols, grenades, and specialized climbing gear, including Bangalore torpedoes to bridge wire obstacles. You've seen them surely many times in movies and in video games. These are basically to be stuck under a fortification through the length of this tube and then blown up, of course, at a distance with a fuse. Early setbacks struck. LCA 914, a supply craft carrying reserve 3006 and 45 ACP ammo, sank, losing critical stores, and LCA 860 sank with 20 men and D Company's commander, Captain Harold K. Slater, though all were rescued by nearby craft. So even just psychologically imagine, yes, these guys knew that everything can go wrong, and lots of things actually will. You can't be sure of that. But imagine all of this, all the already the tension that was beginning to already wear you out to a degree. A navigational error, by the way, by ML-304, recounted by Lieutenant Kenneth Eichner in a 1994 letter to after the battle, led the flotilla toward Pointe de la Percée, which is almost 5 kilometers east to Pointe du Hoc. Rather, in the lead, LCA forced a course correction west, by the way, clashing with the British navigator in the process, who briefly suspected an abort at that point. So just imagine that, because we went that close for this operation not even to take place to begin with, to lose the probably track of the right landing zone, or at least in the with all the difficulties of fixing the problem, different elements of the force, like being scattered during the crossing. The 38-minute delay, in fact, to 0708 hours, scuttled plans for a two-pronged assault from both flanks, forcing all craft to land on the eastern side of the Pointe du Hoc. Right, so this also was another factor. There would have had to be an actually, say, pincer maneuver. It may have not changed too much, but let's say already the fact that you have a plan in mind, you're sort of sticking to that, even for your own emotional security. That is already sort of changed. Naturally, you're trained to fall on this backup plan and perform it to the excellence that Rangers were trained for specifically. Rangers, we don't need to introduce them, but they have an incredibly intense training, mostly focused on reciprocal support, aside from, in this case, their technicalities stemming from, in fact, this specialization in climbing, in, getting through also pretty tough terrain, always with this very high sense of covering each other's back, right? Acting as a cohesive unit. So all these problems triggered a contingency redirecting the Ranger main force, which were essentially A, B, and C companies, 2nd Rangers and 5th Rangers totaling over 400 men, to Omaha Beach, where they were to pass through the 116th Infantry's lines and actually fight to Pointe du Hoc, right? So they actually landed in another sector and to move along the beachhead perimeter by having to cope with the Germans shooting from the other side, passing, by the way, through other American units that were fighting in those positions. You understand it's definitely not ideal. Casualties were taken. The general also difficulties in communication or mostly in the predictability of the exact timing, etc., was definitely unnerving. Expected by noon, these elements arrived only on June the 8th, right? So they were probably blocked for 2 days, enduring, in fact, 5 German counterattacks along the way, leaving Radlers, at this point only 225 men, isolated for 48 hours. This is the extent to which things went the way they didn't have to go, because we're talking basically 2/3 of the entire force, which, if you understand also how closely things went to to failure for the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc, you realize things had been properly planned, right, to deliver the adequate fire, the adequate force necessary to carry out the task in relative security, at least, of overcoming the German resistance. Besides, the delay amplified German alertness, with sentries spotting the flotilla at 2 kilometers, beginning to shout like their warnings. The white flare signaling a garrison braced for combat. By the way, their discipline honed by months of coastal watch and their fanatic determination. At 0708, the Rangers, however, landed on this, and you can see also in the pictures at the bottom, this 500-meter rocky shingle beach under a maelstrom of, not from the sea, but of German fire, right? MG-42s delivering 7.92 millimeter rounds at a cyclic rate that created, as you know, the famous buzzsaw effect, unforgettable noise, unmistakable noise, ripped through the air, in fact, at 820 meters per second, shredding flesh, probably body parts, and splintering rocks all around, which, meant there were literally these shells flying around. 81 millimeter mortars launched 3.5 kilogram high explosive shells with 10 meter blast radius. Kar 98K rifles fired 7.92 millimeter rounds with pinpoint accuracy at half kilometer, and Model 24 stick grenades, half a kilo heavy, exploded in 5 meter kill zones. A white flare logged in the 1st Infantry Division's journal aboard USS Ancon confirmed the alertness of the German garrison, estimated at 125 infantry and 75 artillerymen, which was roughly correct, reinforced by elements of the 352nd Division. The Comtesse Div 36 Diary Action Report described Rangers, quote, pinned under the cliffs and being rapidly cut to pieces by a prepared enemy, occupying fortified positions reoccupied after, in fact, the devastating naval gunfire lifted at age 5 minutes. The psychophysical toll was crushing, right? This was really devastating in the beginning, which makes all what happened later all the more extraordinary. And this tells you also how tough these men really were. So first of all, like imagine as a ranger experiencing some sort of tunnel vision due to the fact that you must basically, to avoid panicking, properly fixating on something, holding on to a specific mind stabilizer. We can imagine their breathing ragging at 30 per minute, muscles trembling from the aforementioned almost 30 kilos loads, and actually the temperature as well, because this was 10 degrees Celsius seawater, so definitely not warm, and ears ringing from explosions. It's something terrifying, and the moment you complain about getting a headache in the morning or whatever, just think what this man went through in the moment, knowing, by the way, they could be torn to pieces from a moment to another. There was basically no way to stop this and that, except, in fact, taking action. Germans entrenched in, let's say, 30 centimeters thick bunkers fired with mechanical precision. Their training overriding fear. If you visit the Pointe du Hoc, you can't get that very perspective inside some of the bunkers. Though the sudden naval barrage caused some to flinch, their hands shaking, as well as they reloaded 250 round MG-42 belts. USS Satterley, a Summers-class destroyer, 900 meters offshore, opened fire at 0710. So after 2 minutes with 5-inch 38 caliber 127 millimeter guns, targeting a concrete pillbox mounting an MG-42. To support the Rangers that had immediately signaled the dreadful situation. For many, this 2 minutes would be too much. So this pillbox, 10-kilogram shells dispersed defenders and shattered their confidence, with some abandoning posts as a result of the bombardment. ML-304 screws raked the cliffs also with 7.7 millimeter machine guns, while LCS-91 struck by 20 millimeter Ehrlichon cannon fire and hold below the waterline sank after Lieutenant N.E. Fraser returned fire with a 2.7 millimeter Vickers machine gun, scoring hits on German positions before sinking. This was very intense, but don't underestimate naval gunfire, because it all combined. It's something really crushing, intense, and on D-Day it was dramatically evident, especially to the Germans. 6 of 10 LCAs foundered 90, 100 to 180 meters out. Their bilges overwhelmed, but most Rangers drenched and weighed down, swam, or waded ashore, taking cover behind 1-meter boulders and craters in the process. Their bodies already shaking from hypothermia, as well as adrenaline for this, humid wake up, and their minds locked on survival, as German fire was pinning them within 10 meters of the cliff base. That was thus the safe zone, right? But with very compressed space for these hundreds of men. So this was brutal, right? Just from a psychophysical experience, just the sheer noise, people around you would say their skulls emptied of their brains, limbs scattered around, just the general sense of tension you could read in other people's eyes is something beyond description. However, as we've also seen in other videos for the military of other countries and ages, in a pretty universal fashion, this is exactly where training and discipline really kick in, right? These are elite troops in particular. There is something broadly mechanical and that is soothingly almost hypnotic in the repetition of this specific actions you have constantly been trained to, so that you enter basically into them as a unit by the way. So you really rely on one another, which is, as we were saying before, probably what the Rangers focus on by their spirit, by their identity. The Rangers employed meticulously rehearsed tactics to scale the 30.5 meter cliffs using 101.6 millimeter rocket-fired grappling hooks with 19 millimeters manila ropes launched from LCAs, handled rocket projectors firing 30-meter lightweight ropes, and 5-meter sectional aluminum ladders. A 12.2-meter clay and rock mound collapsed by pre-D-Day bombardment from the USS Texas. We're talking from 355.6 millimeter shells, each essentially 680 kilos, right? And 600 tons in particular. So let's say 544 metric tons of bombs from the 8th and 9th Army Air Force B-17s and B-24s, as you know, are hell of quadri-engine bombers that are basically the mules of the war as far as the Battle of Europe's carpet bombing was really concerned. And it tells you also how sort of concentrated, even on smaller targets like this, they could be, and especially in this case, providing in the process, in this remolding, let's say, of the geography, an improvised ramp for the same Rangers. The bombardment ending at age 5 minutes left 5-meter craters, but allowed Germans to reoccupy 2-meter deep trenches. Lot of sort of fortifications there were shattered, in a sense, even more complicated than this, but of course, having disarticulated most of the German sort of sense also of the situation, their senses dulled by, in fact, the concussive roar, but resolve stiffened, if anything, by orders to hold at all costs. And these troops, if anything, at some point, we will talk about them as well, knew, of course, what was coming. They had been trained exactly for this staunch resistance under heavy bombardment. Rangers fired the aforementioned 101.6 millimeters projectors securing lines, while others assembled 3-meter toggle ropes under fire, their hands bloodied by rope burns, by the way, and rock shards, because, again, you're trained to do this, but the situation is pretty different from the one training. We know how much, say, accuracy decreases in such moments, but they knew, of course, how to deal with this. They also had partially gone through that before. That's, again, where training really means a lot. Their breathing labored at this point likely 40 breaths per minute, because you have also like all the work. Bangalore torpedoes blasted 2-meter gaps through wire, but shoe mines triggered by a mere 4-kilogram pressure wounded 8 Rangers. Their horrifying screams and severed limbs shattering squad cohesion, forcing comrades to suppress panic. Because again, it's raining blood, all right, and pieces of flesh. And this is one of your friends that are shouting, they're dying, they're bleeding out. And for something that basically, is in the ground, you can't properly even, you must get through it. It's basically just like a gamble. That's what the military is all about. Germans spotting the climbers at 20 meters, leaned over trenches, firing this closer range with their MP40s. It was very useful in that situation. 9 millimeters, as you know, 900 rounds per minute. And tossing grenades. Their shouts mingling with the crack of the Karabiner, Achtung 90 rifles. Within 5 minutes, the first Ranger, likely from E Company, finally managed to summit. This was epic. We can imagine, just physically having pulled this off just requires a remarkable athleticism. Imagine your muscles burning, burning. You have climbed like it through your own muscles. So across this 30-meter escalade, followed by E Company's 65 men from LC 888 by we are 0723, fanning out in what the official U.S. account called a, quote, wild and frenzied scene. This means that it's beyond description. Small fire teams of 5 to 8 Rangers armed with M1 Garands, as you know, 8-round clips, semi-automatic bars, 20-round magazines, automatic, and MK2 fragmentation grenades. We're talking 0.6 kilos, 5-meter blast radius, engaged Germans in close quarters combat. This was wild. The Americans cleared 10-meter trenches with bayonets and point-blank fire. It is really, you're blowing people's brains out and sticking your blades deep in their shouting selves. The Germans fighting from these, as we've seen, 30 centimeters thick bunkers countered as they could through their angles with MP40 bursts and bayonet rifles on their side as well. Their faces grim with determination, their own pulses racing, and this point is wild, right? It's like 110 beats per minute. Imagine like facing a ranger, right? 3 meters away. Like, this is really insane. This is really crazy, and the most brutal part of it all, arguably, because it's not just shooting someone, say at 10 meters, of seeing them dead. It's just, you have to literally, rip their hearts out. And so imagine all this, the air, atmospherically speaking, like environmentally, the air reeked of cordite, blood, and sweat. Like, you have pieces of people scattered around with rangers stabbing and shooting at arm's length. Plus, you don't see even that well because your vision is blurred by smoke and rage, debris. Imagine like the situation. Explosions, close range. While Germans, driven by fear of losing the battery, fought with desperate ferocity as they felt now cornered with their cohesion fraying as Ranger speed overwhelmed their positions. Rather, establish a command post in a 2-meter cave at the cliff base, coordinating via hand signals, which is clever. The noise is too loud, and runners due to radio issues as well. Later moving to a destroyer 20mm Flak 38 emplacement that was located roughly 50 meters east of the battery. At 0725, Eichner transmitted, quote, men up the cliff. On the SAR 300 radio over the Ranger command frequency, followed by praise the Lord at 0745. This gap, by the way, is fascinating because it takes 20 minutes to assess, of course, that this had gone well, right? The man may have gotten uphill, but what's going to happen there? You can imagine what actually happened in those 20 minutes, right? Which is better to glaze over. Naturally, the situation was actually far from being resolved. So all men were up. It was a big deal. Just as a unit, they had pulled it off, as we've seen. There were still, however, persistent radio failures, likely due to water damage, as we've seen some of these devices had gone underwater, but there was also signal interference. So this brought to some also unknown in the equation with the command, etc. The Rangers' rapid ascent had basically disrupted German command, with junior officers shouting conflicting orders, their voices hoarse as they tried to rally troops stunned by the breach, while these were being gunned down. Were in definitely not the best situation to receive those orders. The Rangers expecting 6 155 millimeters aforementioned GPF guns in the casemates found wooden telegraph poles as decoys, indicating that these guns were had actually been relocated to evade the bombardment. At 9, a two-man patrol led by Sergeant Len Lommel and Sergeant Jack Kuhn, moving 200 meters south along a hedgerow-lined track from the Grandcamp-Maisy road, discovered 5 155 millimeters guns. So one previously destroyed by air raids. These were in an apple orchard, camouflaged with nets and foliage aimed, in fact, at Utah Beach's Sector Charlie, and guarded by approximately 100 Germans from the 352nd Artillery Regiment, reorganizing at that point under their officers after the initial shocks. Lommel, in a 1984 ITN interview, noted the guns were moved on June the 3rd due to thousands and thousands of bombs from aerial bombardment and ships. They were not, in fact, the ones of 3 days later, but the ones that the Allies had poured in the previous months. We explained how there was, had it been genial, really also an absurd bombardment campaign all along the Atlantic. Let's say the more sort of northern French sector of the Atlantic, will to actually deflect like any suspicion regarding which sector the Americans had already chosen to actually land. Right, these were all tests, also launched just to take photographs at some point of the coastline. So the Allies had uniformly bombed all places, including this one. And so the Germans had already moved these guns without knowing, by the way, precisely where still the Allies would attack. Using stealth, the patrol crawled through 1 meter high grass, their hearts pounding, we can imagine, at 130 beats per minute. This is physically shattering, by the way. Evading detection by 10 meters. This was Lommel's patrol that succeeded in placing thermite grenades, we're talking almost 1 kilo each, in the guns, elevating and traversing mechanisms, melting gears and bearings with 2200 Celsius degrees heat, and smashed their Zeiss optical sights with his M1 Garand's butt, while Kuhn covered with his Thompson submachine gun, his eyes scanning for movement. Short of grenades, a second patrol under Sergeant Frank Rupinski arrived, placing additional thermite grenades, ensuring all 5 guns were inoperable, essentially 10 minutes later. The Germans, unaware of the sabotage until too late, continued reorganizing. Their officers barked orders drowned by distant gunfire, their focus split by reports of landings at Utah. This swift action neutralized the threat to Utah Beach, by the way, because as we've seen, those guns were pointed exactly, especially at Charlie sector. And it's not like guys were having fun over there, but it would have been much worse had these pieces started their concert over them. Achieving thus, and this is actually the big accomplishment of this all, the primary mission critical to the D-Day landings, boosting Ranger morale while sowing confusion among German gunners. At this point, another phase of the action began. So you managed to silence most German artillery so that this fortress uphill is basically stormed and knocked out of use. However, there are still Germans into this position to eradicate. The German garrison, as we've seen, had been fully alert, launching ferocious defense and counterattacks with the 716th Infantry and 352nd Division, including the 726th Regiment's 9th Company and Stoßtruppe reserves from the 3rd Battalion, supported by 105 millimeters FH-18 howitzers and 88 millimeters flak guns positioned 3 kilometers inland. By midday, Radar's force reduced to under 100 men. This tells you the staggering amount of casualties between, as we'll see now, killed and wounded. Faced 5 German counterattacks, suffering at this point, by this point in total, compared to the roughly 225 men, initially 70% casualties. We're talking about 135 KIA or WIA, which meant that in practice there were only 90 combat effective men, besides exhausted, right? The Germans were faring that better, and at this point, actually, the Americans, to a degree, were, in fact, the defenders uphill. The combat was brutal. Rangers fought in small decentralized teams across a lunar landscape of 5-meter craters and shattered 30 centimeters thick bunkers. An MG-42 NES 200 meters east, likely a tripod-mounted gun in a half-meter thick concrete emplacement in a 20 millimeters flak 38 300 meters west near the observation bunker, maintained relentless fire on the American position. The machine guns 7.92 millimeter rounds cutting down Rangers at half a kilometer away, their bodies jerking with each impact. This is savage, by the way, because bullets at that distance are going to arrive scattered also in various directions, like, they're falling all around, relatively close, but always in different places. At 0740, a 12-man D company, patrol, by the way, had assaulted the Flak 38 using fire movements tactics, one squad laying suppressing fire with bars. We talked about them in our recent videos about machine guns, even though this was actually an automatic rifle, but it worked still as such by doctrine, 650 rounds per minute, 7.62 millimeters, while another advanced with MK2 grenades. So it was really typical. You have one squad suppressing the enemy with solid fire, say M1s and bars, right? So you really have the heavy shot, like both high rate of fire and relatively precision one. So if you get your head up, you get a bullet in your forehead. So you get around them with Thompsons, with M1 carbines, and you throw grenades at them, and these guys are basically caught between two fires, attacked from the flank. They're destroyed. They're gonna move. You're gonna tear them to pieces. If you were lucky, of course, because the Germans could do similar things. As we've seen, it's not like they lacked firepower. In fact, these American troops were actually repelled by MG-42 bursts and 81 millimeter mortar barrages. So imagine you advance and you have in front of you like literally machine guns emplacements, and in way across like mortar shells exploding. We're talking about 3.5 kilos shells. They were, big blasts, 15 meters in radius, leaving, by the way, just one survivor. Imagine, your entire unit getting knocked out, your face bloated and eyes wide with shock. This guy stumbled back to Radar's command post 100 meters away, because you have all these pockets basically, and you don't know where the enemy is going to come from. You have the scattered, tired, exhausted units that are also under constant fires. It's terrible with German counterattacks and not much room for further maneuver. As you enter out, you have this kind of situation, and you can't even clearly see at that distance. Right, those 100 meters were obscured by 2 meters high smoke and debris. The Germans, emboldened by the slaughter of Rangers, shouted, like "Kameraden," like in mock surrender, luring Rangers into kill zones. Right, so this is a wicked irony, let's say. And their discipline restored by veteran NCOs that had arrived there and were sort of directing them towards better tactics through, in fact, experience, greater control. So there was a second American team supported by a 60mm M2 mortar team firing 1.6 kilos high explosive rounds at 1800 meters, shattered by 105mm artillery, though, likely from a German battery near Crequeville-en-Bessin, killing or wounding all but 2 Americans. By the way, their screams echoing as shrapnel tore through muscle and bone, like tearing these human beings literally apart in different chunks. You can imagine what this looked and it just chillingly sounded like. Rudder himself wounded in the leg by a 7.92mm bullet. We're talking as early as 0745. The round passing through flesh without hitting bone, which was relatively fine, limped on, his pain masked by adrenaline. That does really mask that. It's incredible how we are actually wired for stress, like situation, fight or flight response. We're talking here probably 0.0 milligrams per liter in blood of adrenaline. This is insane and intense, right? Especially as you're wounded, and in this situation, it's all like your body's reacting in many different ways. Rudder kept directing operations with a field telephone and runners, his voice steady despite blood loss he was going through. Another MG-42 position resisted until USS Thompson's 127mm shells, guided by observer reports, obliterated it at 0815. Consider the difficulty in correctly locating it just through coordinates, because you couldn't quite see it. And this, in fact, collapsed 10 meters of cliff into the sea, resulting in the death of 6 Germans whose bodies were crushed under rubble, shaking the resolve of nearby defenders in the process as well, because that was like a thundering storm. One DUKW, unable to approach the cliffs due to 3-meter deep bombardment-induced craters visible at low tide, saw Sergeant William Stevison extend a almost 30-meter Merryweather ladder and fire twin 7.7mm Lewis guns at German defenders, each gun firing 500 rounds per minute. Swaying uncontrollably in almost 2-meter waves, by the way, Stevison maintained fire for 3 minutes, suppressing 2 German positions 20 meters above, his arms straining and vision blurred by sea spray, until the ladder's instability forced him to actually desist. The Germans, momentarily silence suppressed, would resume fire later with renewed vigor, their morale bolstered by this DUKW's retreat. Naval gunfire was nevertheless the linchpin of the Rangers' survival in this hellish circumstance. USS Satterlee, Thompson, and Harding, coordinated by Lieutenant P.C. Johnson's Shore Fire Control Party, which summited at 0728 and used light signals and smoke markers due to SCR-300 failures, delivered pinpoint 127mm salvos, each destroyer firing up to 210-kilogram rounds per hour. The Comtesse de 36 action report praised Satterlee's quote-unquote excellent fire control, noting it enabled the Rangers to establish a foothold by neutralizing clifftop threats, killing an estimated 20 Germans and wounding 30, which, considering the troops on top, wasn't bad, definitely. USS McCook's 127mm guns knocked one 20mm Flak 38 off the cliffs, where at 8:20, and another was blown skyward by a direct hit. Its crew incinerated in a 1000 Celsius degrees fireball, shattering German morale in the western sector, because you literally have, your comrades vaporized in front of your eyes. By 9, Desron, 18 destroyers, including USS Barton and USS Texas, firing 355.6 millimeters shells from 12,000 yards. We're talking almost 11 kilometers, each with the aforementioned 680 kilogram warhead, close to within 1,500 yards. So again, I don't know, almost 1,400 meters of the Omaha sector. Their salvos, described by Samuel Eliot Marsden, proving critical in repelling German counterattacks, reducing 3 bunkers to rubble and killing 15 defenders in the process. Another DUKW attempt failed when Sergeant Gordon Lunn fell into the sea while extending a ladder at 0830, but was rescued by an LCA crew, his body numb from the aforementioned 10 degrees Celsius water. At 9, Rudder's force critically low on 7.62 millimeter 3006 Springfield, 11.43 millimeters 45 ACP, and 60 millimeters mortar rounds, signaled 5th Corps via the Navy, quote, located Pointe du Hoc, mission accomplished, need ammo and reinforcement, many casualties. Hubner's response relayed through Satterlee was a stark quote, no reinforcements available, reflecting the chaos at Omaha Beach mostly, because we covered that in the other videos, and this is also notorious. What was happening on there was no less horrifying than at the Pointe du Hoc. And a much, bigger extent. So the aforementioned sort of crisis, not knowing, right, how the situation would be stabilized. At Omaha Beach, it's basically not until dusk that, the Americans established, at least for the night, some good positions beyond the beach. This was basically in the morning. At that point, you imagine what you see, I don't know, in different, Saving Private Ryan first scene, sort of the 116th Infantry stalled basically on the beach. Still, Rangers fought in squads of 6 to 10, using fire and movement to clear snipers armed with scope carbines, 98K, effective at 800 meters, and bunkers reinforced with 25 centimeters concrete walls using 4 kilograms satchel charges to blast 1 meter holes. The Germans, driven by fear of encirclement, fought with their submachine guns and the Panzerfausts. These were, as you know, like some 6 kilogram warheads, 30 meters range, mostly for anti-tank purpose, but good also at, blowing up, a squad that fell like next to this grenade launcher hit. Their shouts of seemingly like things like "Für das Vaterland," mingling with the Cracker rifles, their resolve stiffened by the arrival of 50 Stoßtruppe reserves at 10. Sergeant Leonard Goodgull, a paratrooper from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment 101 Airborne, landed nearby during the night, heard the gunfire. Right, we talked about the paras that, as you know, were going arguably even through the most hellish picture at large. Like speaking of the wall units, they had been scattered all around. Some of them, they contributed to attack the Germans from the rear while they were fighting on the beaches, right, against the incoming allies. And Goodgull marched, quote, this is from the source, marched to the sound of the guns, in fact, literally being led where action was ongoing, joining, at that point, Rudder's force at, we are at 9:30 a.m., with, equipped in this case with an M1 carbine. So you know that this is a quick weapon, 7.62 millimeters, 15-round magazine. He's present, if anything, steadying a squad rattled by losses. It's not bad to have a one-on-one guy joining the ranks. Now, at 9 p.m. on June the 6th, the longest day that it had been, with 1/3 of his men killed or wounded, Radar was reinforced by 23 men from A Company, 5th Rangers, these were the guys that, as we've seen, had been stranded on Omaha Beach before. The latter were under Lieutenant Charles H. Parker Jr., and they had, this had occurred between Vierville and Saint-Laurent. Parker's unit fought 2 engagements against German strong points at 3 and 5 p.m., respectively capturing 20 prisoners in the process with useful weapons, and the aforementioned MP40s and Panzerfausts, and marched overland to the Pointe du Hoc. So basically adhering to orders to rendezvous, so at that point, so late, right? Better late than never. As we've seen, fights would not stop for the ensuing days, and the whole perimeter the Allies had achieved, had gained, was, however, not secured at all. German counterattacks were still going on and threatening the entire beachhead all along the landing grounds. The Rangers established a roadblock on the Grandcamp-Maisy road. We are at 9:30 p.m. using also captured German MG42s, very useful, together with their 250 round belts and 60 millimeters mortars to repel probes by 20 Germans. We are at 10:30. So imagine, yes, it is close to the solstice, but there is just so much light at this point. Of these 20 Germans, 5 were killed and the rest were scattered in the process. Their morale shaken by especially this unexpected resistance. I mean, what kind of men are able to still go on fighting at that hour after the entire... Because the Germans knew that the Allies had been battered at that point, but not just they had, again, gained ground, but they were keeping on fighting. This unit was elite, so the effect was amplified with unexpected effectiveness in the resistance. On the day +1, June the 7th, the Germans, pressured by the 101 Airborne at Carentan and the 4th Infantry Divisions at Utah, withdrew to the River Or. We've seen what this entailed in the video about the landings that deal with, in fact, the following days as well, just basically the first week. And so this brought to the access to form a new line with remnants of the 352nd and 716th Divisions, totaling about 1,500 men, with 88 millimeters guns and Nebelwerfer rocket launchers. These were portable, like imagine 15 centimeters rockets with a 10-kilometer range, by the way. They're pretty handy in this not at much at that greater distance, but still, like, especially concentrated close range, and this was mostly also at a closer one. Radar's force, now fewer than 90 fit men, with scant food, by the way, K rations depleted, held a 200-meter perimeter around the observation bunker, using 5-meter shell craters and 2-meter trenches as fighting positions. Their bodies beyond exhausted, right, with bloodshots, with bloodshot eyes and hands cramped from gripping weapons. You can imagine what those eyes had seen throughout the whole day, what had impressed in these people's minds. They would never forget about it if they made it alive out of there and later during the war. The same, imagine like living on your immediate survival instinct triggered basically at any moment throughout the day, with extremely brief scattered respites, and realizing that you're grappled like around that kind of control, that you manage to maintain all this with exhaustion literally bringing you down, wanting to sleep, needing to give up, but your instinct of survival keeping you well awake. A whaleboat sent to evacuate casualties grounded in still 2-meter seas on the rocky beach at 7 p.m. and was abandoned. Its crew joining the defense instead, with M1 Garens mostly. The 5th counterattacked at night, likely by the 352nd Stoßtruppe, wielding, again, submachine guns, grenade launchers, breached the perimeter at 10 p.m., advancing to within 20 meters of Rudder's command post. At that point, Rangers repelled the assault with concentrated bar fire, with their 650 rounds per minute and MK2 grenades, supported by, importantly enough, USS Harding's 127mm shells, which fired at this point with satisfying precision, given the Allies on land were starting to know the terrain a bit better. 150 10-kilogram rounds in 20 minutes, resulting in the death of 30 Germans and the wounding of other 40. By the way, their screams piercing the night as the attack collapsed. Imagine just the results of this in a pretty graphic sense. Friendly fire incidents compounded the ordeal. By the way, this was also one dramatic aspect of the war that you can't sort of heroicize in this already bloody mess. Rudder himself was wounded in the arm by concrete splinters from a bunker hit by USS Barton's 127mm shells at 11 p.m. Consider he was already shot, as we've seen, through the leg. So imagine now the pain it radiates through your shoulder with the whole articulation inflamed. Human body is a pretty awfully fragile thing. On top of this, P-51 Mustangs and 29th Division 155mm howitzers mistakenly targeted with combined fire from air and land the Rangers at 8 p.m., killing several in 3-meter craters. Their deaths framed Ranger morale, but hardening their resolve to hold anyway, because the Germans were still out there. So imagine just what that, like when you think that there can't be anything worse, you have your own planes and artillery shooting on you, right? Quite nicely with rockets and shells, even machine guns, probably, or the P-51s. Now, on June the 8th, relief arrived. 48 hours late. 48 hours in this situation, right? Imagine yourself in there. You can't, all right? The first already. And so basically this beachheads and what had already been seized beyond were sort of catching up with one another with mutual support, especially along like the east-west axis, because we've seen they began to link up with the other at the extremes of this, as the Germans were either withdrawing or simply being slaughtered in some pocket. The Shermans, of course, like with their 75mm tank guns, 48 rounds per tank and 50 caliber, that is 12.7 millimeters machine guns, blasted. At that point, it must have been such a great satisfaction from the Rangers' viewpoint through German strong points manned by the 352nd Division's 914th Grenadier Regiment, supported by 88mm guns that, remember, are effective at 2 kilometers range. So the battle was still infuriating. Naval gunfire from USS Harding and USS Barton shot 127 millimeter rounds. Do you realize how, what the terrain is going to look after a naval artillery bombardment? Everything is razed to the ground. All right, it's all craters. It's all like you can't even probably orient yourself because you would have been given an actual description of what you would have found in front of you. Certain areas at least would have probably been leveled. And again, combat is dynamic, of course. Mostly the problem is that there are people on the other side, not what the terrain looks like. Also because it's where mostly everybody has to fight, or at least, the naval bombardment is going to hit the Germans anyway. But we're talking here really pretty gruesome, like even just for how much the Americans did actually hate the Germans. Let's dispel this myth that, they're soldiers, aside from the fact that many were volunteers in this case in particular, but that, it was the government sending the people that didn't want to fight or whatever. They wanted just to live in army. These people all hated each other's guts. It would have been really satisfying to see, especially the cavalry has arrived with naval and aerial bombardment, and these Germans literally flying to the sky into pieces. But, try to walk into this, right, and see what happened to these people. Right, in many ways at this point, whatever sensitivity you may have had to violence was gone, even just in the first hours of the bit. But still, that's something that, especially in that heightened moment, is definitely something else. It's really something you're mostly concentrated on not giving up under that pressure yourself. But this sight is not necessarily helping you more than much. It's not going to spirit you in particularly good mood just per se. And again, I'm sure that was somebody who would be able to enjoy that, or maybe somebody who had no effect, at least still in a positive, like psychopaths that of course exist in the army as well. The day +2, 11 a.m., the relief force linked with Rudder's garrison. This effectively ended the so-called siege here of the German forces, because essentially 30 minutes later, stars and stripes were raised atop Pointe du Hoc, symbolizing victory after 2 days of battle that cost 135 Rangers killed or wounded. I would remind also our American followers of this, just saying, in days like today, aside from the anniversary, but what this actually means, right? 81 years later. Besides, we talk about the killed, you have really this visions like of young men, you were really, just more than kids at the time, just after their school years with a dreadful notion that they had someone at home waiting for them. This is valid also for the more mature men. You can imagine their families, their spouses, their children in particular, their parents, even the classmates, even their same comrades. These people are gone, right? There's literally people who were there. Further contribution they would have made had they survived. We know, however, what they were able to do with their part, right? And their names at large are forgotten. It's not like you know them, and so many allies lost their lives in the Battle of Europe and beyond. There is always this missing, this hole, this gap, this sense. Where was this person? There's not more. The process of, again, putting a blanket over the remains, identifying them through tags, waiting for the mortuary crews to identify the corpses, to take them away, etc. It's just one side of the story of the war, of course. What really makes you think is also the people who were wounded. and were wounded badly. Like people who lost their limbs, who lost probably like much more than we can imagine, and not just physically. That sometimes is horrifying enough, but the impact that this had on their minds afterwards. Whether they got that, whether some of you asked me, like even in different contexts, like Vietnam, etc. Since we talk about tradition, like how much does the 20th century man actually knows about the past, about the sort of metaphysics of things that go well? Probably people who went through this knew a bit more than that we can imagine. I personally work even with sources of people that really went through hellish experiences, say through World War One. They wanted to get it over with later, and they found, for example, a reason to live by learning tradition. It's difficult to hear the stories of this art because you almost never hear that, right? When you think about veterans, interviews, etc., yes, you can find, if you're more specifically interested in sort of the most horrifying, disfigurate people, like, with enormous massive handicaps. It's something unspeakable, but it's not like this is something that is provided to you. Nor probably these people are normally that up to for a talk. But there is all a story behind them that I think is important to remember behind the sort of this moment of the action. Right, even when you think about D-Day, you just, it's pretty cool. Let's admit it, including the violence, even the gore, like all what, especially like as kids, we have come to acknowledge through video games, through movies back in the day. But then we don't think we're not presented with the surrounding. This is what I point out with the general narrative of the war, of politics, of history, and beyond. And in fact, this is a pretty close world to our own, one that our grandparents lived really in, especially if you have sort of more distant generations of your family by age. Like in my case, it's something pretty fresh, right? I live alone. For example, what were my paternal grandparents, right? They died here. There are no more. I live here. I have their photos, their pictures from World War II here in the drawer, in the living room, etc. Like it, I don't know. It's their house, all right. And they risked, right? My grandfather risked very much, right? And we're talking access here, by the way. So I have also sort of interesting stories, terrible stories, by the way, and. My grandfather had a life afterward. He wasn't visibly traumatized by something horrifying that happened in front of his eyes. People shot like just next to him, a bomb falling just next to him. Like he had to tell the stories, like a bit like Abe Simpson. Sometimes you don't know how much is, not myth in the sense it was made up, but how concretely this happened really. But there were tough stuff. Equally, my grandmother did witness pretty horrifying things from a civilian side mostly. Here we are, I would say. So this is not just a remote story or visual. Here I used some sort of catchy pictures because, of course, YouTube keeps you a bit more entertained if when images are on, and we can all recognize the references that look more familiar. But this is real. Also, when you get there, as I was saying at the beginning of the video, it's Pointe du Hoc is just as beautiful. It's also ugly because of all the fortifications and everything. You can see the shattered coastline. For the rest, of course, beautiful nature, beautiful place. France is just one of my top favorite countries for vacations. The foreign country I visit the most. Like I was there like 15 times, and we're part of the wall. So I think the way history links you to this stuff should be particularly deep because war is being fought today, still, in our responsibilities, our involvements. what we can do and what we don't do is real. It's easy to turn your head. It's easy to say, well, this is basically just entertainment. I can't tell you that it's not, right? Especially when you know and care about people that are in that. So it's easy instead to relate as far as your family members are concerned, especially if they are fairly close, right? What can we say? Of course, here the hero of the story, rather in particular, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership. Later commanded the 109th Infantry Regiment from December the 8th, 1944 to the Battle of the Bulge. I made a video about the Battle of the Ardennes. If you're interested, we can so you can find that, but we can also go further in depth in various sectors of that. Besides, it was really assigned here. Rudder's unit defense there against the 5th Panzer Army's 12th SS Panzer Division earned a presidential unit citation. So this is really a hero of war. The site, again, we could talk about the site. I could show you the pictures at some point, but it's preserved since June the 6th, 1979 by the American Battle Monuments Commission after a handover attended by General Omar Bradley honors the Rangers' sacrifice in one of the day's most iconic operations. The history of Pointe du Hoc is that ruthlessly brutal. It just gives you immediately, at a first glance, the sort of the difficulty, like the physical, environmental difficulty of this battlefield. That is not a field, in fact. And knowing the story of it is chilling. Some stories, of course, also from the adjacent Omaha, as you know, are terrifying, and they're sort of very relatable. The Allies struggled pretty much all across the landings, but you really can see here something really vital. Here we're not talking specifically about broader strategical, tactical implications. If anything, strategical implications. We observed that in a more comprehensive way with the other beaches, with the other landing sectors, and this sort of joins in its overall aspect. Of course, the Pointe du Hoc was very much instrumental to, make life easier, so to say, to those who were fighting in Omaha and Utah by essentially eliminating the German positions and the high ground from which they could really target through enfilade fire, those beaches, and it's pretty, and you can see it from there, by the way, very well. It gives you really a concrete idea of the advantage provided by that position. So this was, I think, the first video I've ever made about a specific action or something, let's say, lasting a couple of days, let's say in a more concentrated context, a few hundred men really. We never talk that much in smaller scale, but I think it's useful because, that with World War II, for the sake of example, we can do it with all wars, but this was evidently the biggest. So in this sense, imagine all the various sectors. That's why I was saying for the Battle of the Ardennes, I don't know, at some point we'll have to talk Bastogne, if we talk about other, also secondary, because something rises to mythological importance, like for example, the Battle of Pointe du Hoc. But it's also intertwined. And that's what I always say, that when you want to study military history, you have to look at the bigger picture first and then descend into the smaller ones to realize how concrete the fight really was. Because until you talk about losses, you can say, wow, all these people died there, seriously. But it's when you actually look at what happened and how desperate combat really is, you realize how these people physically died and how, concrete, like the military logic behind this dynamics really is. And the more you realize the sheer intensity of the effort, right, it's much more sort of relatable at an individual level, right? But of course, understanding broader strategical implications is also very important, because at the end of the day, what happens there is because of the plan. It's because we talked about this. I made an entire video about the preparation for Overlord, and all went into it, that it was utterly insane, the most brilliant operation ever carried out. Pointe du Hoc was just a tiny part of it, paradoxically also one of the most important and famous and iconic and so on. Very well, I'm glad I covered this for today. However, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.